Howdy folks, so this is part 3 of our Gameolgy series on open world game design. Be sure you check in with parts 1 and 2 before you check this one out. In part 2 we talked about the difference between size and density in an open world game and asked the question of which is more important between the two. I determined that density is far more important than size because it doesn't really matter how big your open world game is if the world itself is just paper thin, which is a mistake that I feel a lot of video game designers tend to make these days. But I left off with that video asking the question of if it was possible to achieve that level of density while still having a good sized game world. And the answer to that question is yes. And in order to achieve it, it's actually very simple. You just kind of have to apply basic fundamental game design to something. And to illustrate this point, let's talk about fundamental game design. And for example, let's talk about the level design in Doom. When people think of Doom, they tend to just think of it like a corridor shooter, but there was actually a lot more thought put into the level design with Doom than a lot of people think. The architecture of the levels was very complex. Enemy placements, the amount of ammo and health drops, stuff like that, where they spawn from, the best tools for the job, types of enemies that you face. All that was very carefully considered when it was crafting Doom. And you can see that kind of design in just about any good video game. Compare that to a bad first-person shooter from the time, which really was just, your basic corridor shooter where if they wanted to make something hard, they would just put you in a long corridor with no cover and then just throw a bunch of enemies at you. So that's taking game design and just kind of ignoring it, and the results are pretty evident. Doom is an excellent game, is still an excellent game on all fronts, and there were a lot of Doom clones from the time that don't hold up because they didn't really put in the work to make their games as good as Doom was. Now, a lot of you guys might be asking, why the hell are you talking about a linear level-to-level FPS when you're talking about open world gameplay? Because everything I just talked about with Doom, the enemy placement, the level design, all that stuff, that's all stuff you need to be thinking about when you're making an open world game too. And to illustrate that point, let's talk about Infamous. So Infamous is an open world game on all fronts, but if you've actually played Infamous, you know that a lot of times it definitely does feel like a level game. There are a lot of different sections of the open world that are designed with specific missions and gameplay in mind. You can tell that when Sucker Punch was planning missions for the game, they were really thinking about how they would play out in the city and actually design the city accordingly. Now, that actually ends up working to the advantage of the game because not only does it make for a more memorable cityscape, but it just works better for gameplay. The locale in Infamous is actually very memorable. I can remember a good chunk of landmarks, events, the train mission, for example, the tower in the center of the neon, stuff like that. In a bad open world game, they tend to not have something like that. They tend to just create this big, wide, open world space and then just, have very fundamental objectives to it. Now, there is a fine line that you need to keep in mind when you're designing your open world, though, and that's that you need to keep in mind that you are also making an open world game and not just a level game. So one mistake I see a lot of open world games make is that they tend to relegate the missions into a very specific section of the open world, and if you deviate outside that area, you get a mission failure. Playing Infamous, you might be surprised to know that there actually aren't any parts of the game that are like that. No matter the mission, there isn't a designated area that you have to stay in, which is good because that allows for a bit more freedom in how you approach combat. So, let's say you're in this mission where you're trying to move this train and you have to stop to take out the enemies. You can, of course, drop to ground level and fight them, but you can also take to the rooftops, attack them there, use Cole's mobility to flank them. There's a lot of different ways you can tackle your objectives in Infamous, and that's why it works so well as an open world game. But there are also tricks that Sucker Punch employed in order to, keep players in a specific area. For example, in the mission where you have to defend the prison from the Dustmen, obviously you're trying to defend a point of interest, so, you have a little less room, but, it still functions in the open world. It's a memorable location, and you can actually return to that location later on in the game for side missions, battles with enemies, there's collectibles to find, and it still feels wholly organic. It's not like they took you out of the open world and plucked you into another level. That's part of why I think Infamous has held up so well as an open world game, because you can definitely see that tight design in Sucker Punch's efforts making the game. A lot of thought and care was put into the design of the open world in Infamous, and that just pays dividends. The game still holds up beautiful. Now, let's look at this from the perspective of a game that doesn't have this careful design, and one that comes to my mind is Sonic Frontiers. Let's be real, the open world design in Sonic Frontiers just sucks, dude. All the open world is in Sonic Frontiers is just a series of big, barren wastelands that just have, random elements that you would typically see in a Sonic game in them. There's no thought to missions, the enemy placement is completely random, and some of the elements can just send you going in a bunch of random directions. Especially in the third island where they start locking you into 2D sections. And what were you thinking with that, guys? I mean, that the whole idea of wanting to do an open world game is to give yourself as much freedom as possible, and anything that just kind of dictates which direction you're going to be going for a set period of time, that kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? Another poor choice in regards to how people design open world games is something that's actually become very common with a lot of recent video games, and that's what I call checklist design, where rather than taking the time to actually create that density, they instead create sort of an artificial density to it. What do I mean by that? Well, be sure to join me next time for part 4, and I'll explain to you about checklist design, as well as the general dangers that that kind of design philosophy can pose to people trying to make a good open world game. Until then, guys.